books were secular, and my friends were mostly secular or Jewish. I did know a few Christians, but they were theologically liberal. When I visited their church, they stood in a circle, held hands, and sang the civil rights anthem, "We Shall Overcome." I was not impressed. They seemed to be merely putting a Christian veneer on secular progressivism. It was obvious that in my school and social circles, theologically conservative Christians were a tiny minority. I couldn't help wondering, why do they think they alone are right and everyone else is wrong? So I started asking, how do we know Christianity is true? Just that. Nothing about the problem of evil and suffering. Nothing about how a good God could send people to hell. None of the typical questions young people ask. Only the most fundamental question of all. How do we know it is true? No one could give me an answer. My parents are ethnically Scandinavian. On my father's side, my grandparents crossed the ocean from Sweden, and on my mother's side, my great-grandparents were from Norway. In these countries, the state church for centuries had been Lutheran. As a result, my parents were baffled by my question. Their mindset seemed to be, but we're Scandinavian. What else could you be if not Lutheran? My pastor had not studied apologetics, so he had no answers to offer. An uncle was the dean of students at a Lutheran seminary, so I hoped he would have some more substantial answers. But all he said was, "Don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes." Where is a parent to get guidance on how to address their children's questions about God? Mama Bear Apologetics is stepping into the breach. With real-life, down-to-earth examples from their own families and lives, they are making apologetics clear and accessible to ordinary parents. This book will equip you to get started with a basic awareness of the questions young people are raising today, questions your own children are also likely to ask. Until recently, fewer women than men have been interested in apologetics. But that is changing rapidly, especially among women who have children. In 1991, I was the founding editor of Breakpoint, a national daily radio program featuring Chuck Colson. Though the program was only 5 minutes long, my goal as the editor was to ensure that every Breakpoint program gave listeners a kernel of Christian worldview and apologetics teaching, both in the radio commentaries I wrote myself and in those I edited written by staff and freelance writers. I made sure that the program used current events as a springboard to educate listeners on the underlying secular worldviews at the root of social trends. The goal was to educate listeners on how to think critically about secular worldviews and to offer a Christian response. In short, Breakpoint aimed at teaching apologetics in a very accessible format. And here's what we discovered. When we covered topics of concern to parents, that is when we sparked by far the largest response. The way we gauged responses was by call-ins. When listeners liked a program, they were encouraged to call in and request a transcript. This lasted the first few years until demand grew so high that we had to outsource the service. It was blindingly obvious which topics attracted the highest number of call-ins. Anything that helped parents to equip their children. The numbers always spiked when we talked about issues related to topics like education, what is being taught in the public schools, entertainment, children's movies and video games, literature, books for children or young adults, and evolution, giving parents tools to help their children answer questions raised by science. What we learned was that many people may not be terribly interested in apologetics for their own sake. After all, by the time they're adults, many of them have already settled whatever questions they had, but they are intensely interested into helping their kids stay Christian. And they are aware that their children are facing much tougher questions than any previous generation. That's why the time is ripe for Mama Bear Apologetics. With each new generation, worldviews shift, which means the questions you and I had may not be the same questions our children have. We cannot simply rely on what we already know to pass on to our children. The best motivator for apologetics is love. We need to love our children enough to listen.